Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're venturing into Europe, specifically the period between roughly 1200 and 1450.
Right.
It's a time when, well, pretty much everything was changing across the continent. Society, politics, economics, all in flux.
Absolutely. It's a really complex picture.
We've gathered a lot of information, and we want to help you understand some key shifts. We're focusing on, I guess, three main areas.
That's the plan. First, the huge role of religion.
Yeah.
Then, the way political power worked or didn't always work consistently. And finally, how agriculture underpinned, well, almost everything.
Okay, and with religion, we're talking mainly Christianity, right? Both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox.
Yes, those are central. But we also need to touch on the presence of Islam and Judaism in Europe during this time. They're important parts of the story, too.
And politically.
Yeah.
You mentioned decentralization, so not big empires like Rome earlier.
Exactly. In Western Europe especially, things were much more fragmented.
Yeah.
We'll get into the feudal and manorial systems there.
Okay. And agriculture. Connecting that to the social structure. Makes sense.
Yeah, it was the foundation. So our goal today is to kind of peel back those layers, look at the core elements shaping Europe in this really pivotal era.
Great. So let's start with religion then. It seems like it touched almost every part of life back then.
Oh, absolutely. Christianity was without doubt the dominant force.
Huh.
But as you said, not uniform.
How did it get so established? Goes back to the Roman Empire, doesn't it?
It does. Emperor Constantine's conversion was a massive turning point. Christianity became a sort of unifying glue for the empire for a while.
But then the empire split, or rather the West fell apart in 476 CE.
Precisely. And that's where the paths really diverge. The Western Roman Empire collapsed politically, but the eastern part, the Byzantine Empire, continued on.
And it kept Christianity going strong.
Yes, but it developed its own distinct flavor, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And crucially, in Byzantium, the church and the emperor were very closely linked.
Ah, so religion was used to support the emperor's power there, centralized control.
Very much so. The emperor and the patriarch worked closely. It was a very top-down system, you could say.
Okay, so contrast that with the West after 476.
Well, the West fragmented politically. No single emperor, lots of competing kingdoms and lords. But remarkably, Roman Catholic Christianity didn't just survive, it thrived.
So even without a central political power, the church itself became a unifying force.
Exactly. The Pope in Rome, the bishops, the whole structure. It provided a common identity and often a kind of moral authority across these different political units.
So the Pope could actually wield real influence, maybe even more, because there wasn't a single strong emperor to challenge him.
That's a key point.
Yeah.
The church often filled a power vacuum, mediating disputes, influencing rulers. Its spiritual authority translated into, well, real-world leverage.
Meanwhile, back in the East, the Byzantine Empire, it didn't last forever.
No, it faced centuries of pressure, particularly from rising Islamic powers. Territory was gradually lost.
Until the big one, 1453.
Right. The Ottoman Turks conquer Constantinople, a monumental event. The end of the Byzantine Empire as a political entity, and Constantinople gets renamed Istanbul.
Wow. But Eastern Orthodoxy, the religion itself, it didn't just vanish.
Not at all. It found a new center of gravity, you could say, with the Kievan Rus.
They're in Eastern Europe, right? Modern Ukraine and Russia, roughly.
Yes. They'd adopted Eastern Orthodoxy much earlier through contact with Byzantium, and they consciously modeled aspects of their society on Byzantine examples.
Like what?
Things like their church architecture, the Cyrillic alphabet, which was adapted from Greek, and this idea of a close relationship between the church and the state.
So still that tendency towards a more centralized church-state link, unlike the West.
Generally, yes. The Western model remained much more politically fragmented, even though Roman Catholicism provided that common religious layer.
And you mentioned the church hierarchy in the West: Pope, bishops, priests, like a framework holding things together.
Exactly. It was an incredibly important institutional structure across all these different kingdoms and lordships.
Did the church ever try to, actively unify the West politically or militarily?
Well, the Crusades are probably the biggest example of that. Attempts to unite European Christians, mainly knights and lords, against a common enemy, primarily Muslims controlling the Holy Land.
How successful were they?
Militarily, mostly not in the long run. The First Crusade had some initial success, but later ones largely failed to achieve their main goals. But they did have other consequences.
Like what? You mentioned trade earlier.
Right. Even though the military aims weren't often met, The Crusades did kind of reopen channels between Western Europe's and the trade networks of the Mediterranean and the East.
So more goods, more ideas flowing back and forth.
Yes, an unintended consequence, perhaps, but a significant one. Increased contact, increased commerce.
Okay. Now, we've focused heavily on Christianity because it was dominant, but Europe wasn't only Christian.
Absolutely not. We have to remember, Islam had a major presence, especially on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. By 1200, much of it had been under Muslim rule for centuries.
And Jewish communities.
Yes, Jewish communities existed throughout Europe, often small, dispersed, but playing important roles in trade, finance, scholarship, various crafts.
But they face difficulties. Minority status often does.
Definitely. They were minorities, and sadly this period saw significant anti-Semitism, prejudice, discrimination, sometimes violence. Jewish communities were often marginalized, pushed to the fringes.
A darker side to the religious landscape, then.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit now to the political side of things. You stress the decentralization in the West, no big empires at the start of this period.
Correct. That fragmentation is key. Instead of one emperor ruling everything, you had this system we call feudalism.
Right, feudalism, we hear that word a lot. What did it actually mean for people? Like, if I'm just a regular person, how does feudalism affect my life? Am I even aware of it?
That's a good way to think about it. On the ground level, feudalism was about relationships, basically. Obligations based on land and loyalty.
Okay.
So you'd have kings or very powerful lords at the top, but they didn't rule directly over every inch of land. They granted large chunks of land, called fiefs, to lesser lords or knights.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for loyalty, promises of military service, things like that. So it's this whole web, a hierarchy of lords and vassals, all bound by these personal oaths and land grain.
A web, right. And you mentioned manorialism earlier. Is that connected?
Very much so. Manorialism is like the economic engine running within that feudal framework. The fiefs, the land holdings, were often organized as manors.
And what's a manor, exactly?
Think of it as a largely self-sufficient estate controlled by a lord. It included the lord's house or castle, fields, pastures, woods, a village.
And the people living there? The regular folk?
Mostly peasants. Many, perhaps most, were serfs.
Serfs. Now, are they slaves? Or is it different?
It's different. That's important. Serfs weren't owned like property, the way slaves were. But they were bound to the land. Meaning they couldn't just pack up and leave the manor if they wanted a better life somewhere else. They needed the lord's permission.
And what did they do?
They worked the land. Some of it was the lord's land. They had to cultivate that for him. They also had small plots of land for themselves to grow their own food. And they owed the lord various payments or services.
In return for what? Why would anyone agree to this?
Well, agree might be a strong word. Often it was inherited status. But the deal, in theory, was protection. The lord, with his knights, was supposed to protect the serfs from bandits or outside attack.
So security in exchange for labor and being tied down.
Essentially, yes. Limited freedom, limited opportunity, but a degree of security in a pretty dangerous world.
Right.
That was the manorial system. And it really defined rural life for centuries.
So this decentralized feudal system with manorialism at its base, that's the picture for much of Western Europe early on. But you hinted things started changing later, towards the end of our period, say 1200 onwards.
Yes, absolutely. We start to see a gradual but definite shift. Monarchs, kings in places like France, England, Spain, they begin trying to consolidate their power.
How did they do that? Weren't the lords pretty powerful?
They were, but monarchs started to build up their own resources. They developed larger armies, more directly loyal to them, not just reliant on feudal levies from the lords.
Ah, okay, standing armies almost.
Moving in that direction, yes. And they also built up bureaucracies, officials loyal to the crown to help manage the kingdom, collect taxes more efficiently, administer justice.
So basically trying to bypass the lords sometimes, exert more direct control.
Exactly. They were chipping away at the traditional power of the nobility.
And I imagine the nobles didn't always like that.
Not at all. This led to a lot of tension, sometimes outright conflict, between monarchs and powerful nobles. But the long-term trend was towards more centralized monarchical states.
Which means more competition between these stronger states.
Precisely. As monarchs grew more powerful internally, they also started looking outwards. More competition for territory, for influence, leading to more wars between kingdoms. Wars of conquest become more common.
Okay, so we've got the religious landscape, these shifting political structures. But underlying it all was agriculture, wasn't it?
Fundamentally, Europe in this period was overwhelmingly agricultural. The vast majority of people worked the land. That was the economy, basically.
And this ties back directly to serfdom and manorialism.
Absolutely. The agricultural system relied heavily on labor. Some of it was free peasant labor, people who owned or rented small plots. But a huge chunk was coerced labor.
The serfs.
Primarily the serfs, yeah. Bound to the land, obligated to work for the lord, part of that manorial system we discussed.
So the whole social structure, lords at the top, peasants tied to the land at the bottom, it's directly shaped by how agriculture was organized.
Inextricably linked. The hierarchy, the lack of mobility for many, the focus on local self-sufficiency on the manor, it all stems from this agricultural base and the system of labor, particularly serfdom, used to exploit it.
It really dictated the rhythm of life.
Completely. Planting seasons, harvest times, the obligations owed to the lord, that was the framework of daily existence for most people in Western Europe.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. We've done a deep dive into Europe, 1200 to 1450 or so.
Yeah.
We've seen the massive influence of Christianity, Catholic West, Orthodoxy, but also the presence of Islam and Judaism.
Right. The religious tapestry was complex.
Politically, we saw Western Europe mostly decentralized, fragmented under feudalism and manorialism.
But with monarchs starting that slow push towards more centralized power later in the period.
And underpinning all of this, an agricultural society based heavily on coerced labor, especially serfdom, which shaped the whole social order.
That really captures the key elements, I think. Religion, power structures, and the agricultural base all interacting.
So thinking about all this, what's a final thought for you, for our listeners, to maybe chew on?
Well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How did these specific foundations, this particular mix of religious influence, the legacy of feudalism even as monarchies rose, and this deeply ingrained agricultural system with its coerced labor, how did all that set the stage for what came next?
Like the Renaissance? Or the Reformation.
Exactly. Or even later economic changes. Were the seeds of massive future transformations already being sown back then in the way society was organized, the way people thought about faith and authority, the way they worked the land? How much of later European history was shaped, maybe even constrained by the structures put in place during this period?
That's a really powerful question to end on. It reminds us that history isn't just one thing after another. It's all deeply connected. Thank you for walking us through that complex period, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions.